Welcome to a special edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint. And in this video, we're going to continue taking a look at some of the critical tools that are needed for the academic study of the Septuagint. We've looked at some lexicons. We've looked at Rahlfs Honhart, which is the more common minor edition that most students are familiar with. But in this video and a few more to come, we're going to take a look at what is known as the Göttingen edition of the Septuagint. This is a picture of the first 5 books, and this is the main source for more rigorous study of the textual tradition of the Septuagint. We'll take a look at some of the other options that are available as well down the road, but in this particular video, we'll introduce what it is. I'll show you what a typical page looks like, and then in subsequent videos, we'll get used to some of the symbols and abbreviations and how the different critical apparatus work and so forth. We'll look at examples, but in this video, we're just getting our feet wet and get oriented to what exactly it is. This edition began with a fairly simple but really ultimately very quite complicated goal, which is to produce a comprehensive, eclectic, that means it is trying to pull from multiple textual traditions and multiple manuscripts. It's not a diplomatic edition that only reproduces one particular manuscript like Vaticanus or something. It's an eclectic one that's pulling from multiple ones to try to reconstruct the oldest attainable Septuagint text, what we would call the Old Greek. And it is a critical edition. It's a major critical edition that is in contrast to Rahlfs Honhart, which is a minor critical edition, which is not a value judgment. It just means it's smaller in format, doesn't have as much textual evidence at its disposal. A major critical edition is in principle trying to cover the waterfront in terms of all the manuscript evidence, as well as church fathers and the versions and so forth. So this is a massive project. Now, it began in 1908 with Alfred Rahlfs. If you recall from those videos, he set out with this particular goal of producing the definitive critical edition of the Septuagint. But he realized pretty early on that it's not something that he could himself do. He did one fascicle of it, namely for the Psalms, but he settled, if you will, for the smaller edition, left it to future generations to carry the torch forward for this major edition. So the ball was picked up by Werner Kapler and then a few other scholars, including Robert Honhart, really up through 2015. So we're talking about over a century of work producing different volumes in what has become a very lengthy series where basically one book of the Bible is at least has one volume in the critical edition. But funding, this is initially under the Septuaginta Unternehmen, which I introduced with the Rahlfs Honhart videos. Funding with that essentially ran out, and so from 2016, it's now shifted to be under the auspices of the Göttingen Academy of Sciences and Humanities, but that funding sort of dried up as well, so now it's actually under the oversight of the Robert Honhart Foundation, and that's where it sits today, at least as of the production of this particular video. What have they produced so far? And this is just a few images from some of the volumes. And thus far, the books from the Old Testament that have been completed include all 5 books of the Pentateuch, produced by John William Wevers. Ruth has been produced, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra Nehemiah, including the apocryphal version, but the Ezra Nehemiah volume. Esther, the Psalms, including the Septuagint Odes. Ecclesiastes, one of the more recent ones by Peter Gentry. Job, the 12 prophets, that's actually in one volume, and then individual volumes for Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, as well as Daniel. So you'll notice some of the major figures include Wevers, you have Honhart doing several of them, and Ziegler as one of the major producers, and then there's a handful of other folks who have been involved. We also have a few books from the Apocrypha or Deuterocanon that have been produced, and so that includes both Judith and Tobit, separate volumes for them, individual volumes for 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, and 3rd Maccabees, the book of Wisdom of Solomon, as well as Sirach, and so you can see Ziegler has done a lot of this. The Psalms of Solomon, which is not technically part of the Apocrypha, it is included because that particular book is found in some of the manuscripts of the Greek. And then you have the various additions to Jeremiah, namely Baruch, and then you have some of the additions to Daniel, like Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, and so forth. And those are in the Daniel volume, but you can see they're separate works. Now, Important to note that this particular edition, though it's been underway for over a century, is actually incomplete. And so as of 2025, here are the books that are still in progress, including the names of the scholars that are working on them. You'll notice it's a much more diverse group now. You don't have just one person kind of doing a boatload of them like we had earlier in this whole project. And so Joshua's underway, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, First Chronicles, because Second Chronicles was done. Psalms is actually undergoing a revision. And in a lot of respects, the Psalms volume, even if you look at it, we'll look at it on the road, is measurably different than some of the others. You can tell that it was kind of a draft, if you will. Although it's quite good, it doesn't have as much of the substantive rigor that some of the other volumes have. And so that was being redone. Proverbs, Song of Songs, and then bringing up the rear for the apocryphal books. Really, this one's actually really a pseudepigraphal book, is 4th Maccabees. So that's what is in store. So in the meantime, we don't have Göttingen editions of any of these books, and so there are other things you have to use for the critical text, and I'll cover those in future videos. Well, let's take a look at a particular page from, in this case, Genesis. Now, right out of the gate, you'll notice that the layout here is both similar to Rahlfs, but also dramatically different. A few familiar things. You'll have the title here at the top. That's all fine. You see the text and then some sort of apparatus. So the basic framework is the same. But if we just zoom in on the actual text itself, you'll notice that on this particular page, there's only 4 lines of text. Sometimes you might have maybe a little bit more. Sometimes you might even have, say, 3 lines of text. And that's because this is a major critical edition. In other words, the emphasis is not only on showing the text, but it's especially on the apparatus. And so many times you'll see just a few lines of actual text and the rest of the page is apparatus. Whereas with Rahlfs, in general, you'll see a fairly good number of lines of actual text, and the apparatus is much smaller because it is a minor critical edition. You'll notice here's a chapter number. You have the verse numbers in the flow of things as you would typically expect, but also similar to Rahlfs, you see them out in the margin, so that helps with navigating. And you'll see it's a fairly clean presentation of the text. I think the typography has changed slightly as they've produced these volumes over the past century. And sometimes you might have a first version and then it's been edited or updated. So you might see some differences there. But in general, it's going to look roughly the same. Now, the next very small apparatus, if you can even call it that, right under the block of text on the first page of a book, or sometimes it might show up if there's a division within a book, is the list of the key witnesses. So in this case, this A would be Alexandrinus, and then you have a little minuscule there, and other things showing up, the Syrohexapla, and so forth. And we'll get into some of these abbreviations down the road. And so this is where the editor is showing you what are the main sources that he or she consulted when producing, or at least trying to put together, the eclectic text. And you notice that in Genesis, there is no B, there is no S. We've covered both Vaticanus, that's B, and Sinaiticus, that is S. They don't have a text for Genesis, at least not in their original form. It was added later by much later scribes. And so that's why they're not consulted as a source for Genesis. So it's important to know kind of what you're working with there. And then in the preface of each volume, you'll find out, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? What all these different abbreviations mean? So that is the list of witnesses, if you will. Then we move to the first real apparatus. Now, this one's going to be a little bit weird because we're on the first page of the book. And so a lot of attention on the first page is given to the inscriptio, that is the titles. And so you'll notice that some manuscripts say Genesis, or some of them say, the book of Genesis. You have some very long stuff like, the beginning of, or the beginning with God of the old holy scriptures of the Bible, and so on. So as you go, the names that show up at the top of these manuscripts get much, much longer, and that's pretty common for biblical books. You'll see that even on the New Testament side, where it goes from being just to the Romans to much longer titles in later manuscripts as a whole tradition about the titles grows. That's not the main point. Just want to show you that this is kind of a special situation, what you see on the screen with this first page of Genesis. Let's take a look at what the actual apparatus typically looks like. And this is a good representative sample of what the text critical apparatus looks like on the page once you get beyond the inscriptio stuff. And much like the Rahlfs edition, what you have And you'll notice this is chapter 1, this is verse 1. And what they provide you is the lemma from the text first. You'll notice that in the text itself, as we saw it just a second ago, there's no footnote indicators, there's no little signs that you'll see, for instance, in Nestle Aland, if that's what you're used to on the New Testament side. They present it very clean, and instead they put a lemma for the reading. So in verse 1, if you go back and look at it, it's epoiesin. That's what God does. Then they provide you with alternative readings based on what manuscripts or church fathers or what have you, where they appear. So apparently there's an option for eplasin there, or ektesin, so formed or created, as opposed to epoiesin, which would be made. And so that's how the text is going to be presented with its variants. We can see the same thing on the next line. So verse 2, we have eoratas, ein, hege, and then it'll give you some options for that. Skatas here with that bracket, so that's your lemma. Some manuscript apparently added a verb there, and so on. Verse 3, genesto here, and phos here. So they're trying to give you the different readings. Now, one of the things that's a little bit tricky about the Göttingen edition is that though there are standards, they are a little bit flexible in how they're applied. It's not always done the same way. And in fact, we see that here with genesto. They don't always give you the lemma like you have it here with that bracket. Sometimes they just give you an alternative reading and leave it up to you to figure out what word that is standing in for. And so in a future video, we'll talk about all those nuances, because it can be rather bewildering for someone who's used to just, say, the UBS New Testament or even Rahlfs Honhart. Göttingen edition can be a little squirrely when it comes to how they present the text. It's a lot of information, but it can be a little bit idiosyncratic. So that's the basics of the main textual apparatus, and that's going to cover actual Greek manuscripts of, say, Greek Genesis here, as well as relevant patristic evidence and things of that nature. Lastly, we have the bottom apparatus, and this is chiefly, but not exclusively, limited to the hexapla evidence. And I'm going to cover all of that in different videos, but just to show you this, you'll see the alpha with a prime indicator. That's for Aquila, or Aquila if you prefer. You have, let's see, an S here, that's Symmachus. The theta here, that's Theodotion, and a bunch of other stuff. And so they're giving you alternative readings that are not found in Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint. They are the later recensions or other attestation. And there's just a lot of stuff. So Field says this, and the HI is Jerome. And so they're throwing a lot of stuff at you. And so if you look at it and you're not familiar with what all this means, it can be, again, rather bewildering. And so I'll try to help you navigate that down the road. Same thing in verse 2. You have Aquila here with a different reading, and so on. In fact, what you might often see, if the reading of, say, Aquila or Symmachus or Theodotion is very, very different than what the editor believes is the Old Greek, then instead of giving you little microscopic variant units like this word here in arche, and then they change that to kephalaio in Aquila or whatever, what they might give you is the entire reading, because it may just not be worth trying to do it in a more microscopic variant unit kind of basis. They might do that as well. So you have to kind of get used to that. And so if you just look at this, it can be quite difficult, and especially for someone who's a little bit unfamiliar with it. But I'll try to give you some pointers down the road as to how to make sense of some of this stuff. One of the challenges of the Göttingen editions, at least most of them, is that even the prefatory material is in German with a lot of Latin and a lot of other stuff. Typically, they don't have English introductions, and so that makes it even more difficult to get your feet wet in it. And so I can't cover it all today, but just trying to at least get your feet wet in what's going on with the Göttingen edition. Now, you may be wondering, how different is it from, say, Rahlfs Honhart? And in general, it's really not that different. I did a statistical analysis of this a few years ago and determined that the gap between the provisional text by Rahlfs Honhart and, at least in the books that I surveyed in the Göttingen edition, is pretty small. There are differences, but it's not like totally different books. There's probably going to be more variance in certain books that are a little bit chaotic in their textual tradition, like Proverbs. You'll probably have a bigger gap there. But if we just look at one verse here, Genesis 2:23, here's the reading from Rahlfs Honhart. So Kai Apen Adam, so Adam said, Tuto nun, astun ekton asteon mu, so this now is bone of my bones. And then sarx ekte sarkasmu, flesh of my flesh. She, or this female. Klethesetai gune, she'll be called woman, because ek to andros altes, from her husband, elemphthe, and then alte, she or this one was taken. Now, if you compare it here with the Göttingen edition, you'll notice that it's pretty similar. So, Kayepen, Adam, et cetera, et cetera. So you see all that's the same. Everything's good up until elemphthe. And you'll notice after elemphthe here, there is no alte like we see here. So we're missing that. So if you scroll down, if you will, look down at the bottom, here's what the editor Wevers shows. He says, okay, at the end of the line, fin, we have a plus of alte. So that's what we see here. That's what he's trying to tell you. And it's obelized in some manuscripts. And he tells us that that is found in RA, that's Rahlfs, as well as the Masoretic text as well. There's a bunch of other stuff he gives you that we won't get into today, but that just shows you that they'll put those kinds of variances, typically making reference to Rahlfs, down at the bottom to show you how to compare the two. So, interesting stuff. Hopefully this was a fun introduction to this very, very important edition, the Göttingen edition. A lot of moving parts, very complicated, but over subsequent videos, I'll try to help you navigate some of the further details. So thanks for tuning in today.